This video is brought to you by Brilliant. If you've ever glanced at the financial headlines over the past couple of years, you'd probably assume that the European economy is essentially finished. Mainstream media outlets regularly publish articles claiming that even the wealthiest parts of Europe, like Munich and London, are poorer than middling bits of America, or warning of the risks of long-term stagnation, often leaning on parallels with Japan post-1990. On Twitter, smug Americans mock apparently impoverished Europeans for not having air conditioning, big cars, or any globally recognised tech companies. The EU itself seems to have bought into this analysis, at least to some extent, which is why they've commissioned their favourite political firefighter, Mario Draghi, to urgently figure out a way to restart Europe's productivity growth. And when the EU posted a relatively meagre growth of 0.3% in the first quarter of the year, it was hailed as a great success, or at least a great relief, in Brussels. However, while there's obviously a grain of truth to all this, and clearly the European economy is in need of reform, there are reasons to think that the catastrophic tone of this discourse might be a bit overblown, and the European economy might well be doing better than you think. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the European economy, why it's doing better than you might think, and what might be done to make it even better. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, as we see it, perhaps the main reason that Europe's economy might be doing better than you think is that when people argue that Europe's economy is rubbish, they often rely on comparisons with America, which are unflattering for at least two reasons. First, America currently has, by far and away, the best performing economy in the developed world at the moment. Just look at the IMF's most recent forecast for the G7, for instance, which predicts that in 2024, Germany will see a growth of 0.2%, the UK will have 0.5%, Italy and France 0.7%, Japan 0.9%, Canada 1.2%, and the US way ahead of the rest on 2.7%. This is for a variety of reasons, but to list just a few, America was significantly better insulated from the food and energy price shocks the rest of the world saw over the last few years, especially because it's actually the world's biggest energy producer at the moment. And the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency means America can borrow absurd sums of money to pay for its apparent reindustrialization via policies like the Inflation Reduction Act. Europe, on the other hand, was uniquely exposed to both the food and energy shocks because it imported a disproportionate amount of Russian energy and Ukrainian foodstuffs. Anyway, while the European countries do indeed come at the back of the pack in those IMF forecasts, the gap between the big European countries and other developed economies like Canada and Japan is a lot smaller than the gap between Europe and the US. On top of that, Canada's growth is mostly driven by population growth, and real GDP per capita actually fell by an astonishing 3.4% between the second quarter of 2022 and the last quarter of 2023, worse than any big European country. Similarly, while the IMF forecasts relatively strong growth for Japan, more recent data suggests this is unlikely to materialise. Preliminary data published by the Japanese government just a month after the IMF forecast came out found that the Japanese economy had actually contracted by about 0.5% in the first quarter of 2024. Europe, on the other hand, has actually quietly outperformed forecasts. The EU grew by 0.3% in the first quarter of this year, slightly above analysts' expectations, which translates into an annual rate of slightly more than 1.2%. Faster than the IMF forecasts for both Japan and Canada. Obviously, the UK isn't part of the EU anymore, but it's often lumped in when people start talking about Europe's economic stagnation. So we think it's fair to mention that in May, the UK grew at an annualised rate of nearly 5%, well above expectations. Eurozone inflation is also now down to 2.6%, higher than the European Central Bank's stated target of 2%, but well down from the highs of last year, and slightly lower than in Canada and Japan. This decline has been achieved without the usual increase in unemployment, which is the normal consequence of interest rate hikes. In fact, the EU's unemployment rate was 6.1% in the first quarter of this year, just above its lowest since the turn of the millennium. Europe has also seen a decline in inter-country inequality, with the southern economies, especially Spain, growing faster than their northern counterparts, especially Germany, which is having a uniquely tough time at the moment. Anyway, in the UK as well, inflation has now fallen to the Bank of England's 2% target, allowing the bank to cut rates for the first time in more than 4 years. So you get the point. Comparing Europe to America is unflattering because, well, at first glance, every developed country looks to be falling behind America. But even when compared against the US, Europe is actually doing surprisingly well once you account for the distorting effect of the dollar's reserve status. In short, when analysts make these comparisons, they convert European statistics in euros into dollars. This would be fine if the strength of the dollar was determined by normal trade patterns. But, well, it's not. Rather, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, its value is mainly determined by capital flows and the demand for reserves, which is essentially a geopolitical question. This is why the dollar has appreciated steeply against the euro over the past decade or so, even though in that time the Eurozone has reliably run large trade surpluses while the US has run large deficits, when orthodox economic theory would predict the reverse. This is why purchasing power parity adjusted comparisons, which basically measure the value of a currency by how much stuff it can buy in its home country, are probably more accurate for transatlantic comparisons, even if they can be a bit imprecise. On this measure, the EU is faring much better. In fact, according to such analysis by The Economist, France and Germany have basically identical productivity levels to the US, having caught up over the past decade or so, and the US only looks like it's doing better because Americans work longer hours. Now, that's not to say that everything's rosy over in Europe. Productivity growth is still stagnant, however you measure it. And Europe is lagging behind both China and the US when it comes to the most advanced tech that's expected to drive economic growth in the future. Nonetheless, the point that we're making here is that when you take into account America's structural advantages, Europe's specific disadvantages, and the distorting effect of dollar exchange rates, Europe's economic woes look more like their cause for concern, not panic. Be sure to keep an eye on this story as it evolves, as much like every area of our lives, this is likely to progress quickly. In fact, if you're feeling left behind by the news cycle and fast developments in AI and tech, you'll want to check out Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Learning a little every day is one of the most important things you can do, both for personal and professional growth. Brilliant helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time. It's the opposite of mindless scrolling and truly helps you to learn quickly, kind of like TLDR. One course I've found to be particularly interesting was their course on large language models. We hear a lot about AI and large language models in the news, but Brilliant helped me actually get hands-on with real language models as you explore how they build vocabulary, choose their next word, and more. They also helped me grasp the importance of training data by comparing models trained on Taylor Swift lyrics to models trained on a cookbook or big text terms and conditions. If you want to learn more and understand the world around you better, whether that's in order to get a job in AI or just to understand what everyone's talking about, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org/TLDR or click on the link in the description. Plus, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching and to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.